Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Commentary. Today, I want to talk to you about a fascinating topic that will doubtless require many episodes for you to fully understand. But I really want you to understand this because this topic will change your life. Because one of the prerequisites of living life in the moment is making peace with your past and with your ego. And for base understanding, every human has a self and an ego that work in unity to develop the talents and gifts of that individual. But, and you knew there would be a but, uh, there, there are things that interfere with that unity. The biggest one, of course, being trauma. And I think there's just a whole lot more trauma in the world than anybody talks about. Trauma um, destroys lives. And so there's Eric Berne wrote Transactional Analysis, and TA is a fascinating understanding of human nature. And in this book, he describes how we all go through ego stages as we are growing up. Stages assigned to years of life, because you pass through stages of ego development as you're growing up. But if something interrupts that development, the ego moves to the forefront. And we tend to function based on what our ego tells us to do. This is rampant in the West, where we live under the illusion that if we just work hard, we will be successful. And we know that the deck is stacked against us commoners. And so it's time we learn about what really takes place within our own minds. In an early development ego state, Eric Berne describes a juvenile ego condition called the little professor. The little professor arises when there's problems for the self and says, "Don't worry, I got it." And so the ego runs everything based upon that problem that you might be having, in abuse and sexual abuse especially. Those are things that totally move people off their life path. And it's a shame, but the perpetrators of all of this, along with the victims, are running on ego generally. I'm not talking about severe crimes against women, okay? So where the ego is involved, there is always, and there is always deception, because the ego's power is only deception. In my view, the ego is the devil. The human ego is the realm in which, if there is a devil, that's where he works. But I think the evil is within all of us. And evil is something that we have to deal with in our human life. And we've been given the path to deal with that by loving ourselves and loving our neighbors. Because the ego doesn't love anybody but itself. And think, for example, of Adam and Eve sitting under the tree. Um, the apple falls, an apple falls. Eve looks at it and says, gee, I wonder if that's really good. It's probably so good that that's why God doesn't want us to have it. And so she picks up the apple and eats it. That to me is a very human response. And Adam and Eve were the first humans, right? Well, so anyway, imagine Jesus walking in the wilderness. He's been there for a long, long time, 40 days, and he is, let me tell you, he's 100% human. He's hungry. So he looks at a stone and says, you know, I bet I could turn that stone into a loaf of bread and feed myself. So that is a very human response to hunger. So did it really require a guy in a red suit and a pitchfork to whisper in his ear, you could turn that rock into a loaf of bread? I don't think so. And that's why I believe that the ego is so vital for us to understand, and that you can learn to recognize the voice of your ego in your head, and you can talk to that ego, and you must remember that you have dominion over your ego. You're perfectly capable of controlling your ego, and because you have the power and the right to. So learn to recognize the voice of your ego, and here's one way to do it. The ego always is interested in itself. So self-centered thoughts, and if you need to study that, study that. Self-centered thoughts always come from the ego. Always. Why? Because the self in the moment isn't concerned with anything. The self in the moment is a very powerful being because it can't be tempted. It can't be lured. It can't be lied to, because at core, the human self knows what to do and struggles with doing it. And that, requires, I believe, overcoming your ego. And I wouldn't tell you any of this if I didn't believe I had done exactly that. I think I have overcome my ego. I have regular conversations with myself in which I talk out loud, and I use punctuation because I'm used to voice to text. So I talk out loud and with myself. And in those discussions, I can find the thoughts that come from that part of my being. Thoughts, remember, are just like wild horses running across the horizon. You don't have to mount every horse. Be very careful in what you do. In that way, you're in the moment, you can't possibly accept anything that is self-centered. Why? Because you're only concerned with inside to out. Inside to out. Everything, it turns out, spiritually is an inside to out job. I learned that in AA 25 years ago. So let me close with that and say that I will continue talking about this ego self thing because I think it's so critical to understanding humanity. It's something that is not generally talked about anywhere, and except at certain levels, and then it's done academically, which is, as you know, a part of the management culture, which I reject. So have a great rest of your day, and Learn to love yourself. Loving yourself is the key to everything. God bless you. See you next time. This is Commentary.